Okay, so here's what you need to understand about what happened in Davos, Switzerland over the past 48 hours. Picture this: the Swiss Alps, January 21st, 2026. World leaders gathering at the World Economic Forum and two speeches delivered in the same venue, less than 24 hours apart. That couldn't have been more different. One speech captured the attention of the world with its clarity, its courage, its vision for the future. The other unraveled in real time as the speaker tried to extract himself from a crisis entirely of his own making. Let me tell you what actually happened, because the headlines right now are focused on Trump's supposed deal, his framework agreement, his claim of victory. But that's not the real story. The real story is how a Canadian prime minister walked onto that stage on Tuesday and delivered what some are calling the most consequential speech by a Western leader in years, and how less than 24 hours later, Donald Trump stood in that same space and revealed something we rarely see from him: retreat. Let's start on Tuesday, January 20th. Mark Carney takes the stage at Davos. Now, if you don't know Carney's background, you need to understand why this man commands the room when he speaks. Former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, the only person to ever hold both positions. When Mark Carney talks about global finance, about economic power, about how the world actually works, people with trillions of dollars under management lean forward and take notes. And what did he say? He stood before that audience and told them something they already knew but were afraid to acknowledge. The rules-based international order, the system that has governed global relations since World War II, is over. Not declining, not weakening, over. We are in the midst of a rupture, Carney said, not a transition. Think about that word choice: rupture. Not evolution, not adjustment, rupture. A breaking apart, a tearing of the fabric that held the world together for 75 years. But here's where Carney did something remarkable. He didn't just diagnose the problem. He didn't offer platitudes about hoping for better days. He laid out a strategy. And in doing so, he indirectly but unmistakably challenged Donald Trump without once mentioning his name. Carney spoke about how countries like Canada had operated under what he called a useful fiction, the story that everyone played by the same rules, that international law mattered equally for everyone, that the strongest nations operated with restraint. We knew the story was partially false, Carney admitted, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, and that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. And then came the line that cut through the diplomatic language. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration, when integration becomes the source of your subordination. Read that again. When integration becomes the source of your subordination. When being connected to a larger power doesn't benefit you, it controls you. When partnership turns to domination. The room understood exactly what he was saying, and more importantly, who he was talking about. Carney spoke directly to what he called middle powers, countries like Canada, like France, like Germany, like Australia, nations with significant economic and military capacity, but not enough to stand alone against the true giants. And he told them something they needed to hear. If you are not at the table, you are on the menu. That line landed like a thunderclap because everyone in that room understood the context. At that very moment, Donald Trump was threatening military action against Greenland. He was demanding that Denmark, a NATO ally, surrender sovereign territory. He was threatening tariffs against 8 European nations. He was treating the Atlantic Alliance like a real estate negotiation. And Carney, without naming Trump, was telling Europe, you have a choice. Stand together or be devoured separately. He laid out what Canada had been doing since he took office, doubling defense spending, signing 12 new trade and security agreements on 4 continents in 6 months, drawing closer to the European Union, building what he called strategic autonomy, the ability to resist pressure, the capacity to say no. And then he addressed Greenland directly. Canada stands firmly with Greenland and Denmark and their unique right to determine Greenland's future. He called the situation a test of NATO. He said Canada's commitment to Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, was unwavering, and he opposed the tariffs Trump had threatened. The speech was delivered in both French and English. It was measured, it was precise, it was devastating. International reaction was immediate. The BBC called it one of the best speeches by a world leader in years. Rolling Stone praised its clarity and courage. Foreign policy analysts across Europe hailed it as exactly what the moment required. Someone finally was saying out loud what everyone had been thinking privately. Now fast forward less than 24 hours. Wednesday, January 21st. Donald Trump takes the same stage, and the contrast was stunning. Trump started with his usual approach, mixing humor with veiled threats, friends and a few enemies, he said to the audience. Then he pivoted to Greenland, and what followed was a performance that revealed just how badly his strategy had backfired. For weeks, Trump had been escalating. First, he said acquiring Greenland was necessary for national security. Then he refused to rule out military force. Then he sent his son on a publicity stunt to Greenland, where Trump Jr. passed out MAGA hats like party favors. Then he appointed a special envoy whose job was to work toward making Greenland part of the United States. Then he threatened Denmark with tariffs. Then he expanded those tariff threats to 8 European nations. And Europe responded by doing something Trump didn't expect. They unified. Denmark, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, the UK. They deployed troops to Greenland for joint military exercises, not to threaten anyone, they said, to defend an ally. Emmanuel Macron gave speeches saying France would not yield to intimidation. Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, said Europe would remain united. The Danish foreign minister insisted that Greenland's territorial integrity was non-negotiable. Even far-right European parties that usually align with Trump pushed back on his Greenland demands. Trump had overplayed his hand, and now, standing at Davos, he had to find a way out. So he did what he always does when backed into a corner. He declared victory. Trump announced that he and Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, had formed the framework of a future deal on Greenland and the Arctic. Based on this framework, he said he would not be imposing the tariffs scheduled to begin February 1st. Framework of a deal, not a deal, a framework. The concept of a deal, as Trump put it in a subsequent interview. And what was in this framework? Trump said it involved cooperation on his Golden Dome missile defense project, it involved mineral rights, it involved security arrangements. But pressed on whether the United States would gain ownership of Greenland, Trump was suddenly evasive. I didn't want to say yet, he told reporters. It's complex. Complex. That's what you say when you're backing down but don't want to admit it. Let me explain what actually happened here, because this matters. Trump went to Davos demanding ownership of Greenland, right, title, and ownership. He said anything less was unacceptable. He threatened military force, he threatened economic warfare, he portrayed himself as unstoppable, and Europe called his bluff. Denmark didn't blink, neither did France or Germany or the EU. They deployed troops, they prepared for the worst, and they made clear that they would invoke Article 5 of NATO if the United States attacked Greenland, which would mean the United States would be at war with its own alliance. The most successful military alliance in modern history would dissolve, and America would stand alone against Europe. Trump looked at that scenario and realized he had no good options. He couldn't actually invade Greenland without triggering a catastrophic crisis. He couldn't impose tariffs without devastating the American economy, and he couldn't just walk away without losing face. So he negotiated what diplomats are already calling a face-saving compromise. The framework isn't about ownership, it's about cooperation, enhanced security arrangements that were already in place, mineral development that Greenland has been seeking for years, coordination on Arctic defense that NATO has been discussing for months. In other words, Trump is getting what the United States already had packaged as a new deal so he can claim victory. And critically, he backed away from the military threat. During his Davos speech, Trump explicitly said he would not use force. Military is not on the table, he told reporters afterward. That's not a trivial shift. For weeks, he had refused to rule out military action. Now, with the whole world watching, he ruled it out. That's a climb down, no matter how you frame it. That's a retreat. The Danish foreign minister was asked about Trump's framework announcement. His response was telling. He said Denmark would not negotiate based on abandoning fundamental principles. We live in 2026, he said, as if reminding Trump that territorial conquest doesn't work the way it did in the 19th century. But here's where makes this moment historically significant. It's not just that Trump backed down, it's why he backed down and what that reveals about the changing nature of power. For decades, American presidents could make demands and expect compliance, not through force, but through the sheer weight of American economic and military dominance. The rules-based international order that Carney described wasn't actually based on rules, it was based on American hegemony. The U.S. wrote the rules, enforced them selectively, and expected deference. And for most of the post-war period, that system worked. Allies accepted American leadership because the benefits outweighed the costs. The U.S. protected sea lanes, it provided nuclear deterrence, it anchored the global financial system. In exchange, allies gave Washington significant leeway on the